Jacob Callahan had always been a man who lived quietly, tucked away on the far edge of the frontier. His ranch was nothing grand, a weathered house, a leaning barn, and acres of dry grassland where his cattle grazed under the endless sky. He wasn't known for wealth or for kin, but for a stubbornness that kept him rooted to land most others had abandoned. The frontier had a way of breaking men, but Jacob had endured, though at a cost. Nights were lonely, and days stretched long, filled only by the sounds of cattle, wind, and his own thoughts. It was hunger that first brought the boy to him. That morning, Jacob had risen early, the way he always did, and saddled his horse to check the outer fence lines. The sun was just beginning to bleed across the horizon when he saw a figure stumbling near the creek bed. At first, he thought it was a wild dog, some stray coyote driven close to the ranch in search of scraps. But as he drew nearer, the truth hit him like a blow. It was a child. The boy could not have been more than 10. His skin stretched thin over bones, his hair matted with dust, his bare feet raw and bleeding from miles of walking. He collapsed at the sight of Jacob, too weak even to run, too far gone to fight. The boy's lips moved, whispering words Jacob couldn't understand, the syllables of a language foreign to his ears. But the desperation in his eyes needed no translation. Jacob dismounted slowly, every instinct torn between caution and compassion. The frontier was not a place where men extended mercy without consequence. He knew the stories of white settlers who found themselves at the end of arrows after offering food to the wrong stranger, of tribes who saw charity as weakness. Still, as he looked down at the child sprawled in the dirt, ribs heaving with every shallow breath, Jacob's heart twisted in his chest. He could not leave him there. With a grunt, he lifted the boy into his arms. The child was feather light, barely more than a sack of bones wrapped in tattered cloth. Jacob carried him back to the ranch, each step heavy with the weight of a decision he knew might haunt him. By the time they reached the house, the boy's head lolled against Jacob's shoulder, his breath shallow but steady. Jacob laid him gently on the wooden floor and fetched water, wetting the boy's cracked lips until he managed to swallow. From the pantry, Jacob tore off a piece of stale bread and softened it with broth. The boy ate in small, desperate bites, as though afraid the food might vanish if he lingered too long. Jacob studied him in silence. The boy's eyes were dark, wide and unblinking, carrying the kind of fear a child should never know. He wore no shoes, only a ragged shirt torn at the shoulder, and around his neck hung a small leather cord with a carved bone pendant. Jacob didn't need to guess where he came from. He knew the tribes that roamed these plains, knew the whispers of raids and revenge, of blood debts stretching back generations. And yet, in this moment, none of that mattered. All Jacob saw was a starving child who would not live to see another sunrise without help. By nightfall, the boy slept in Jacob's barn, wrapped in an old wool blanket. The cattle shifted restlessly in their stalls, uneasy with the stranger's scent, but Jacob ignored them. He sat by the open doorway, his rifle across his knees, watching the boy breathe. For the first time in years, Jacob felt something stir in him that wasn't weariness or grief. It was purpose. But as the hours passed, unease crept in. He remembered the way the boy had looked over his shoulder before collapsing, as though he had been running from something, and Jacob knew the prairie well enough to understand. No one ran without reason. At dawn, the boy stirred. His voice was hoarse, his words clipped and foreign, but Jacob understood when the child pointed toward the horizon and whispered a single word with trembling lips: hungry. Jacob gave him more bread, more water, and this time the boy's eyes softened, a glimmer of trust breaking through the fear. When the child reached out, small fingers clutching Jacob's rough hand, the rancher felt his resolve solidify. Whatever storm this boy had dragged onto his land, Jacob would face it. But he had no way of knowing just how close that storm already was. Because even as Jacob tended to the boy, miles away across the prairie, a dust cloud was rising. 500 warriors were riding hard, their painted faces grim, their bows and rifles ready. They were not chasing cattle thieves. They were not chasing raiders. They were coming for a starving boy, And by the time the sun dipped again beneath the horizon, Jacob Callahan's barn would be surrounded. The boy did not speak much that day. His tongue fumbled over words Jacob could not understand, and the rancher's own attempts at gentleness seemed clumsy and useless in comparison to the boy's silence. Yet, there were moments when something unspoken passed between them, when the boy lifted the tin cup of water with trembling hands, or when Jacob noticed the way he watched every movement with sharp, cautious eyes, like an animal who had been hunted too long to ever feel safe. Jacob tried to work as he normally would, tending to cattle, mending fences, but his mind returned again and again to the boy in the barn. The child had eaten until his stomach could take no more, then fallen into an uneasy sleep, clutching the wool blanket tight around him. He was no longer on death's edge, but the look in his eyes lingered with Jacob, the hollow, hunted look of someone who knew safety was only a temporary illusion. By late afternoon, Jacob decided he needed answers. He stepped quietly into the barn, ducking under the low beam of the doorway. Dust motes spun lazily in the shafts of sunlight. The boy sat up on the straw, his thin frame dwarfed by the blanket wrapped around him. His bone pendant glimmered faintly at his chest. Jacob crouched near him, keeping his voice low, steady. "What's your name, son?" The boy hesitated, lips parting as though the question itself was dangerous. Finally, he whispered something soft, a name Jacob couldn't quite catch. It sounded like Tyan or Taya. Jacob repeated it clumsily, and though the boy's eyes flashed with grief, he nodded once. Jacob tried again. "Where you from, family?" The boy's gaze darkened. He shook his head quickly, fiercely, and for a moment, Jacob feared the child might bolt, run back into the wilderness no matter the risk. But then Tyan pointed toward the distant hills, where the plains rolled into the horizon like an ocean of grass. He pressed his small hand against his chest, then curled his fingers into a fist, a gesture that carried weight even if Jacob didn't understand the words. The rancher leaned back on his heels, uneasy. He'd seen this before: survivors, runaways. The frontier had carved too many stories into men's bones, and Jacob could sense one of them pressing heavy on this boy's shoulders. He didn't need the details to know it was bad. As the sun bled toward evening, Jacob fed him again beans and cornbread this time, and for the first time since arriving, the boy's face softened. He chewed slowly, his eyes never leaving Jacob, as if trying to decide whether this strange white man could be trusted. When he finished, he lifted the tin plate, set it aside with care, and whispered a word Jacob didn't know. His tone was quiet, reverent, like a prayer. It struck Jacob deep. He wasn't a man given to faith anymore, not since burying his wife and the infant son who had lived only 3 days. Years of silence had replaced any prayers he once knew. And yet, when the boy looked at him with that fragile thread of hope, Jacob felt something stir inside him that had been dead for years. Night fell again, heavy and endless. Jacob settled into the barn, rifle across his lap. He could not shake the unease that had been dogging him since he first carried Tyan off the prairie. The boy had been running, Jacob was certain of it. And men who ran usually left someone in pursuit. His fears proved right when the first sound reached him, a faint, distant rumble. At first, he thought it might be thunder rolling across the plains. But the sky was clear, stars sharp and cold. No, this was different. This was the sound of many hooves. Too many to be cattle, too steady to be a storm. Jacob rose and stepped out of the barn. The night was quiet except for that low, growing thunder. He strained his eyes toward the horizon, and then he saw it, a smear of dust rising against the starlight. Moving fast. He felt the blood drain from his face. Tyan had crept to the doorway, his small frame silhouetted in the lantern glow. The moment his eyes caught the dust cloud, his body went rigid. His lips parted in a silent gasp, and then he whispered something that made Jacob's stomach turn cold. Warriors. Jacob's mind raced. He'd heard of the tribes gathering in large numbers, but this was something else. 500 men, maybe more, riding hard, bearing down on his land. He turned to the boy. Why? Why are they coming? The boy's eyes filled with tears. Though he tried to hide them, he shook his head, clutching the bone pendant at his chest as though it could shield him. When he finally spoke, his words came haltingly, broken but clear enough. "They want me." Jacob felt the weight of it settle in his chest like a stone. The boy wasn't just a stray. He wasn't just some starving child who had wandered too far. He was someone important. Someone worth 500 warriors riding through the night. A dozen thoughts struck Jacob at once. He could hand the boy over and end it. 500 warriors against one rancher wasn't a fight. It was suicide. But when his eyes met Tyon's, hollow, desperate, trusting, he knew there was no choice left. The boy was under his roof. And Jacob Callahan was not the kind of man who handed a child to his death. He moved quickly then, shoving hay bales against the barn doors, securing the shutters, making what little preparations a man could make when facing impossible odds. The boy tried to help, fumbling with a wooden latch, but his hands shook too hard. Jacob touched his shoulder gently. "Stay close to me, no matter what." By midnight, the sound was undeniable, the thunder of hundreds of horses, the creak of leather, the guttural chants that rose into the night like a tide of fury. The ranch house would never stand against them. The barn was no fortress either, but it was shelter enough to make a stand. Jacob positioned himself by the doorway, rifle steady, eyes fixed on the horizon. And then they appeared. The warriors came in a wave, their horses kicking up clouds of dust, their faces painted in streaks of black and red. The sight of them froze Jacob's breath in his chest. 500 men, surrounding his land with precision, encircling the barn like a tightening noose. The boy pressed into Jacob's side, trembling so hard Jacob feared his bones might shatter. He whispered a name, a single name, and Jacob caught enough of it to understand. It was the name of a chief, his father. The boy wasn't just anyone. He was the son of a leader. And Jacob, without knowing it, had stolen the child of a war chief. The barn shook as war cries split the night, sharp and merciless. Flames from torches lit the darkness, casting long shadows across the prairie. Jacob's hand tightened on the rifle, his jaw set hard. It no longer mattered what the boy's past was, or what blood feud raged outside. The only truth that mattered now was simple. He had chosen to save this boy. And come dawn, Jacob Callahan would either be remembered as the fool who stood against 500 warriors, or the man who bought a child's life with his own. The barn was a coffin of shadows, every creak of the wood sounding like the groan of a dying ship. Jacob Callahan kept his back straight against the door, rifle clenched in hands that refused to tremble, though his heart thundered as loud as the horses outside. Through the narrow cracks in the boards, he could see the ring of torchlight growing tighter, the silhouettes of riders circling like wolves scenting blood. 500 men in him, with a boy too weak to run and too frightened to speak. The chants began low, a hum that rose like wind across the plains. Drums pounded, a rhythm steady as a heartbeat, and the sound shivered through Jacob's bones. This was no raid born of hunger or chance. This was a declaration. A tribe had gathered to reclaim what had been taken. The boy huddled against the hay, eyes wide, mouth pressed shut as though even breathing too loud might betray them. His hand never left the bone pendant around his neck. He looked so small in that moment, so fragile, that Jacob felt the weight of his own choice crash upon him again. He had pulled the boy from death's edge yesterday, but tonight, that mercy had summoned war to his doorstep. Outside, the drums ceased. A silence heavier than any sound settled over the land. Then came a voice, deep and commanding, carried by the night air with a clarity that made Jacob's skin crawl. "Give us the boy." The words were in English, rough, accented but unmistakable. Jacob's jaw tightened. His eyes flicked to Tyann, who shrank further into the shadows. The boy's tears glimmered in the torchlight. Jacob raised his voice, steady as stone. "He's safe here. He's under my roof. I won't hand him over." For a heartbeat, there was nothing but silence. Then came the roar of hundreds, a sound like thunder splitting the sky. Horses stamped, warriors cried out, the circle of firelight closing tighter around the barn. Jacob swallowed hard. He knew what 500 men could do. He knew the barn would burn, the cattle would scatter, his land would be ground into dust beneath hooves. He knew, too, that no rifle, no matter how steady his hand, could change the outcome. But still, he held his post. The door shuddered with the force of a spear slamming against it. The boy cried out, clutching Jacob's sleeve. Another spear struck, splintering the wood. The barn groaned, its strength waning with each blow. Jacob turned to the boy, gripping his shoulders firmly. "Listen to me. No matter what happens, you stay low. You stay hidden. You hear me?" Tyen's lips trembled. He shook his head violently. "No, you come too." His words were broken, but the plea was clear. Jacob forced a thin, grim smile. "I'll try, son. But if I can't, then you run. You live." The next strike burst the latch. The doors flew open, slamming against the walls as a flood of torchlight spilled into the barn. Warriors poured in, their shadows long, their painted faces fierce. Jacob raised his rifle and fired. The crack split the air, one warrior falling in the entry. Another shot rang out, scattering the front line. The boy screamed, covering his ears against the thunder. Smoke stung Jacob's eyes, but his aim did not falter. 2 more shots before the rifle clicked empty. The warriors did not retreat. They surged forward, spears and tomahawks glinting in the firelight. Jacob swung the rifle like a club, catching one across the jaw, ducking another's strike, but they were too many. The barn echoed with the clash of bodies, the cries of men, the terrified sobs of the boy, and then a voice roared above the chaos. "Stop!" The command cut through the din like a blade. Every warrior froze. Their weapons hovered in the air, their chests heaving, but none struck. The crowd parted, and through the doorway stepped a figure larger than life. His chest was bare but painted in sweeping black lines, his shoulders draped in fur. His eyes burned with a fire Jacob had only ever seen in men who had lost too much to forgive. The boy gasped, "Father." The word was soft, fragile, but it carried like a spark in the silence. Jacob's stomach dropped. The chief, the leader of this storm, the man whose blood ran through the boy's veins. The chief's gaze locked on Jacob, then shifted to his son. For a long, breathless moment, no one moved. The barn, battered and broken, seemed to hold its breath. Tyen staggered forward, trembling. His small hands reached out, but then faltered, caught between the father he knew and the stranger who had saved him. His eyes darted back to Jacob. Desperate, torn, Jacob felt the weight of that gaze. He had no words that could bridge the chasm between them, no plea that could undo the history written in blood and betrayal. All he had was the truth. "He was dying," Jacob said, his voice hoarse but steady. "I gave him food, shelter, that's all." The chief's eyes narrowed. He stepped closer, towering, his warriors shifting at his back like restless shadows. "You kept him." Jacob did not flinch. "I saved him." The silence stretched. The torches flickered. Outside, the horses stamped, restless in the cold night. At last, the chief turned to the boy. His voice softened, a deep rumble edged with sorrow. "Tyen." The boy's lip quivered. Slowly, he stepped forward. The pendant gleamed against his chest as his father's massive hands closed around his shoulders. For a moment, Jacob thought it was over, that the boy would be taken, and the warriors would burn the ranch to ash for the insult of resistance. But then, Tyen twisted in his father's grip and pointed back at Jacob. The barn was silent as stone. The boy spoke in his native tongue, words Jacob could not understand, but their weight was clear. He was pleading, begging for the man who had saved him. The chief's gaze shifted once more. His face, carved in stern lines, did not soften, but something in his eyes changed. He released his son slowly, then looked at Jacob. "You fought 500 for him," the chief said at last. His voice was low, incredulous. "A child not your own." Jacob drew in a breath, steady. "Some things you don't measure by blood." For a long, terrible heartbeat, Jacob thought the answer would be steel. But then, the chief raised his hand. The warriors lowered their weapons. The torches dimmed in the night wind. The storm had passed. When they rode away at dawn, the boy was with them, seated before his father, safe among his people. But before leaving, the chief paused. He turned back, his eyes meeting Jacob's across the broken barn. For the first time, he inclined his head, a gesture of respect. Jacob stood alone in the wreckage, his body bruised, his land scarred. But in the silence of the morning, he felt something he had not known in years. Not victory, not peace, but meaning. History is often written in the clash of nations, the rise of armies, and the blood spilled between strangers. But sometimes, it is carved in quieter moments, in the hand that offers bread to a starving child, in the stand a man makes when every calculation says surrender. Jacob Callahan did not change the course of history that night. His barn still burned, his body still bore scars, and the boy returned to his people. And yet in choosing compassion over fear, he etched himself into a story that mattered. We live in a world where cruelty often seems easier, where indifference feels safer. But Jacob's choice reminds us that the measure of a man is not in the battles he wins, but in the lives he chooses to protect, even when the cost is everything. So when you face your moment, when fear demands silence, when cruelty seems inevitable, ask yourself, will you turn away or will you stand? Because sometimes the smallest act of mercy is the loudest defiance against the darkness.